Hello everyone, this is Sunny from Tokyo, and I'm here with another Casual Sim Racers video. This time I'm going to be talking about the highly anticipated and recently released Automobilista 2, and I'm going to be doing a comparison between Automobilista 2 and iRacing and Assetto Corsa Competizione. Now, because this is a Casual Sim Racers video, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the things that Casual Sim Racers care about, in particular racing against AI and how easy the sim is to set up. Without having to dig into the menu or run custom files and custom settings or having to play around with the force feedback to get it to drive the way that you want it to. In my opinion, one of the important things about being a casual racer is that the simpler the UI is and the easier it is to set up, the less time you spend in the menu, the more time you actually spend driving. So as a casual sim racer, any time that you have to drive is precious time and it's very limited. So I feel like the less time you can spend in the menus, the better. Now, for those of you who, like me, who don't have a lot of experience in sim racing, here's a very short summary of Automobilista. It's a sim racing game that was developed by Reza Studios from Brazil, and it was released in 2016. And it had somewhat of a cult following, and it was famous for a few key reasons. One of the reasons why it was famous is that one of the lead physics engineers for the actual software itself was none other than Niels Huijsenfeld. Yes, that name might sound familiar to you because it's the exact same person who develops the HE Ultimate and Sprint pedals that you've been frequently, probably every minute, refreshing Sim Racing Bay, hoping that they'll show up in stock so that you can buy them. They're still not in stock, I just checked, sorry. But yes, he worked on the actual physics of the game itself, so the force feedback and the tire model was very famous at the time for being quite good despite how cheap the game was. Another thing that people didn't realize is that one of the reasons why the cost was so low is because it didn't actually have real car licenses. So the cars that were in the game were actually like generic versions of real cars. So because they didn't spend money on the actual car licenses, they couldn't actually use real Porsches and real Mercedes cars inside of the sim itself. So you had these generic GT3 and GT4 Ultima cars that existed inside of the game that were sort of recreations of what real cars might appear, look like, and behave like. The other thing that it was famous for is that because it was developed by South American developers, it actually had a lot more famous road courses from South America itself, and a lot of these courses were not available in other sim racing titles. So people would drive in Automobilista because they had access to a lot more content that wasn't available in other sim racing titles. So now that the history lesson is out of the way, let's talk about Automobilista 2, which was the highly anticipated sequel. Of course, that high anticipation was met with equal parts controversy when it was discovered that A, the engine itself was going to be borrowed from Project Cars 2 with Slightly Mad Studios' blessing, and B, the aforementioned Niels Huijsenfeld was no longer going to be involved in the engineering for Automobilista itself. Now, come on, Mr. Huijsenfeld. If you're not going to increase production on those gorgeous, beautiful pedals so that somebody can accidentally buy them at night when their wife is asleep, the least you could do is work on Automobilista 2, right? Joking aside, let's look at the game footage. For the first driving clip, we'll look at Assetto Corsa Competizione, and for the duration of this video, I'm just going to call it Assetto Corsa. I would use the abbreviation ACC, but it just doesn't feel natural to me. It kind of sounds like I'm using the abbreviation for some sort of in-car function, or air conditioning maybe. So I'm just going to call it Assetto Corsa. I hope you'll forgive me. Because Assetto Corsa is, at the moment, only a GT3 simulator, you're going to have a hard time finding better GT3 physics and force feedback in any other simulator on the planet. This is all they do. And where iRacing is seemingly a single shark in the ocean when it comes to multiplayer competitive racing, Assetto Corsa is the only lion in the jungle when it comes to GT3 driving. It's really good, and that's probably why I suck so bad at it. Each car in Assetto Corsa exhibits its own unique oversteer and understeer characteristics, and if you don't master them, you'll certainly be punished for it. There's also a lot more visual and audio detail. You can hear the chassis reacting to road forces and velocity and hear the twisting in the frame as you drive over curbs and rumble strips. Even the engine itself and the exhaust notes just have a lot more detail. And the in-car dash itself is incredibly beautiful, to the point where I feel like I can pretend I own one of these cars just by strapping on my Oculus Rift and looking around inside the cockpit. You almost feel like you can touch the Alcantara. But where it seems to stand alone when it comes to GT3 physics and force feedback and cockpit visualization, it falls pretty flat when it comes to overall VR execution and UI polish. I had numerous issues where Assetto Corsa would randomly delete all of my button mappings and wheel settings, even though every other sim I own has no issues. And getting the VR to look almost not bad to the point where I don't feel sick after 2 laps required a completely custom JSON file and VR settings from the Kunos message forum. The online matchmaking was also really disappointing, and I only recommend driving online if you're part of a driving club or Discord channel. But to be fair, when it comes to online racing, there's really no way that you can make a comparison to any simulator other than iRacing, because even in Automobilista 2, you're going to find yourself having a poor experience when it comes to online racing unless you join a driving club. But when it comes to the AI driving behavior, I also found Assetto Corsa to be the least consistent and realistic, to the point where if you're not careful, any one of the AI drivers is going to send you to the Shadow Realm, or otherwise known as the place in Interstellar where Matthew McConaughey was pushing books through the shelves to his daughter. Overall, while I love the physics and force feedback, I consider Assetto Corsa to be the least casual racer friendly, because open lobbies are a nightmare, the AI driving was really unpredictable, and it just requires too much work to get working right that I don't think that it's a good sim to invest into if you're pressed for time. As I said earlier, I think the less time you spend in menus and configuration, the more time you can spend driving, and I'd rather spend my time driving than fiddling with settings and configurations.
Car on the right. Clear on the right. Well done, mate. Personal fastest lap.
Oh, man. Ah.
The next simulator is iRacing, which many of you are quite familiar with. iRacing is probably one of the most balanced simulators I've ever driven. It doesn't do anything particularly bad when it comes to driving mechanics and force feedback, and while the tire model and physics have been the subject of recent controversy, I honestly don't believe that a casual racer will get to the point where those limitations are prevalent. Unfortunately, most of us are just not that good enough. I will say that compared to the other 2 simulators, I felt that the force feedback felt the weakest and the least detailed, but the physics felt the most consistent and balanced. When you lose the rear end in iRacing and you review the replay, you'll definitely know it's your fault, even if the limit doesn't exist as much as some drivers want it to. In my opinion, the AI behavior itself in iRacing is the strongest of the 3. The AI drivers behave like real drivers. They make clean passes, they don't collide with you, but they will capitalize on your mistakes to advance their position. I couldn't use clever center road stalling to hold back the pack. The only complaint I have about the AI is that it's quite limited. I purchased the 488 GT3 specifically for this comparison video, but I should have done more research because it's not available in AI, which forced me to use the Kia Optima for this comparison. But when I drove the 488 GT3 on a test run on Brands Hatch, I felt like a hero. I put in faster lap times than I did in Assetto Corsa Competizione in the same car, despite only owning the 488 GT3 in iRacing for a few minutes. But this might mean that the physics and force feedback are more forgiving in iRacing, and not that they're more realistic. The UI itself is equal parts good and bad, at least in my opinion. While I like the actual in-simulator UI for its simplicity and ease to adjust, I strongly dislike the actual website UI and the members page. When you're looking at a series page for a particular series that you want to compete in, the site doesn't show you which courses you own or don't own, which forces you to have to go to your profile page and look at the tracks that you own and either make a note or flip back and forth with the series page to figure out which courses that you have to purchase. For a simulator that seemingly wants you to spend your money, you'd think that they would make it easier for you to purchase the necessary courses directly from the series page itself. When it comes to the VR performance, in my opinion it's the best of the 3. It requires no custom settings, and it just works out of the box, and it honestly looks really clean. I could see very far into the distance, and the lighting of the road felt the most realistic. And when I was racing against the AI, I felt like the mirror gave me a very clear understanding of how far the cars were behind me. Despite the game being 12 years old, the graphics in VR looked really good. My final anti-casual criticism with iRacing is the way that they handle balance of power updates. I don't have a strong dislike for the required purchase system that they use, since they invest a lot of resources into laser scanning courses and their online matchmaking system is second to none. But the way that they handle balance of power updates is a slap in the face to people who purchased a car that gets nerfed. People online will say that you only have to buy the car that you want to drive. But if you participate in a series that has multiple cars, for example GT3, and your car is nerfed in a balance of power patch, if you want to remain competitive, you'll have no choice but to purchase the other cars in the actual series itself. I consider this to be consumer unfriendly. It would be nicer if they sold each series as a pack, so if a car is too powerful in one season and it's patched in a BOP patch, someone who bought that car isn't forced to purchase a completely different car in order to remain competitive. Ultimately, rapid regressions of performance in BOP patches mean that people who bought all the GT3 cars are going to remain a competitive advantage. And in my opinion, this gets dangerously close to being pay to win. Overall, it's a very great simulator, but you better make sure that your wallet can handle it. The last simulation I'm going to talk about is Automobilista 2. If you're the type of person who thinks simplicity is beauty, you might just marry this game. The menu is pretty stripped down. The assets and music are also pretty bare. People say online that it has a lot of Project Cars 2 left over, but in my opinion, they took the important parts and left out a lot of the game aspects. However, you can definitely tell there are legacy options from Project Cars 2 when you look at the menu options themselves. In particular, the wheel settings and presets like the Fanatec wheel options that are available reminded me specifically of Project Cars 2's menu. While the menu itself is basic, what it lacks in finesse, it makes up for in consistency and ease of use. I opened and closed Automobilista 2 dozens of times throughout the course of making this video and never experienced so much as one lost setting or configuration. And while the controls menu could use a little more polishing, and I would greatly like to see voice chat implemented, the actual course menu was the best of all three. Automobilista 2 has an easy-to-navigate vertical text list and a useful 2D drawing of each map so you can figure out which version of the course you want to drive and how many turns it has. Starting a race also has a pretty useful and engineered UI, with a lot of advanced options like setting your qualifying time, weather patterns, and even what time you want the qualifying session or practice sessions to start. When it comes to VR, it honestly isn't that far behind iRacing, which is saying a lot, considering Project Cars 2 required me to spend about 30 minutes to 40 minutes setting up custom settings to make it look good. And while the VR isn't as clean as iRacing, I found it to be pretty acceptable for more than 10 laps of driving, and I found myself staying inside of an online lobby for multiple sessions even though I only intended to drive for one. When it comes to force feedback and physics, I consider Automobilista 2 to be halfway between iRacing and Assetto Corsa. The force feedback feels really good, and there's a lot more road details than Assetto Corsa, and it also has slightly more forgiving oversteering correction. The force feedback was a little strong though, which made me dial it down to about 65% gain compared to the default settings. I also really like the way Automobilista 2 drives. The cars feel really good, and the amount of details in the wheel and pedals make it easy to understand how close you are to the limit before you spin out. In particular, I really like the force feedback and physics of the GTR Ultima and the Ginetta GT4. When it comes to racing against AI, the driving behavior was miles ahead of Assetto Corsa, but not as good as iRacing's AI. And I wouldn't expect it to be. It's a $40 simulation, and depending on the subscription you choose, you'd nearly get 1 year of iRacing membership for the same price. But the fact that the AI was this good for a first launch is quite impressive. Despite the bugs, it has a lot of potential. The AI didn't ram me off the course, and when set to 90% skill and aggression, it was not only competitive, but took opportunities to pass me when I made a mistake. In fact, one AI driver went too wide with me on the last turn and the last lap of Brands Hatch and passed me in a few tenths of a second before the finish line. He really kicked my butt. It might sound like I'm praising Automobilista 2 without faults, but there are issues. Despite the game officially releasing last week, there's still a lot of bugs in the online matchmaking system and AI driving behavior. I also experienced a weird issue where after completing the race and going into the pit lane when I finished my cooldown lap, the AI took over my car and drove out of the pit lane, and I was stuck in a cooldown lap loop that required me to force exit the match, losing my results and not allowing me to see my lap times or the session information. There were also bugs in the online matchmaking system where an admin had to force start a race because the race session didn't automatically start even though the qualifying and practice sessions finished. For example, when I tried to review the replay of my race against AI to show a better clip of the driver passing me, none of the replay controls actually worked or allowed me to speed up or reverse the clip. Eventually, the replay controller actually just crapped out entirely and froze. Visually, there's also some issues, like the legs of the driver in VR looking deformed and clipping through the seat. These issues were probably overlooked during the testing because I want to imagine that the QA testers were focusing on the monitor version of the game. With this many issues in the final version, as a software engineer myself, it's a little bit disappointing, but I feel empathetic for the backlog the engineers are probably facing pending hotfixes coming soon. But overall, I'm hopeful. The developers themselves have taken an active approach in responding to comments and feedback online, and I feel confident that they're going to attack these issues aggressively. If you're willing to overlook the rough polish and early bugs of the simulator, I highly recommend purchasing it while the early access price is still active. I feel that the driving physics, force feedback, the variety of included cars, and the large amount of courses that are available more than make up for the minor bugs and quirks that currently exist. In particular, I quite enjoyed driving the Ultima GTR. I felt it offered the most similar driving mechanics to the GTR cars that I drive in Assetto Corsa and iRacing. It's actually been about 3 or 4 tries that I've gotten to get this cut because sometimes my camera just goes out of focus. So I'm going to take a quick beer. Wish me luck. I hope my camera works this time. So overall, my final casual racer assessment of the 3 simulators is for configuration and setup. I have iRacing in first place, followed by Automobilista 2 and Assetto Corsa Competizione in third place. For force feedback and physics, no surprise, I have Assetto Corsa Competizione in first place, followed by Automobilista 2 and iRacing in third. For VR experience, I have iRacing in first place, Automobilista 2 in second place, and Assetto Corsa Competizione in third place. But for a minute, I'm going to go a little bit ad-lib, and I'm going to say that the reason why I have Assetto Corsa in third place for VR is because I don't like to spend a lot of time in menus and configuration trying to get something to work the way that I expect it to. I spent a lot of time on the forums finding the right VR settings that I could use for VR in order to make it look acceptable in Assetto Corsa Competizione, and even after everything that I did, all the Oculus Tray Tool settings, all of the custom JSON files that I set up, I still only got to a point where I still felt sick when I looked outside of the windshield. And don't get me wrong, in Assetto Corsa, everything inside of the cockpit looks amazing, especially like the Alcantara and like the inside of the Ferrari. It feels like you're actually driving it when you look inside of the cockpit and you look at like the steering wheel and the dash, especially like the rear view mirror, sort of like rear camera inside of the car in Assetto Corsa Competizione is pretty impressive. It looks really amazing. But as soon as you look outside of the windshield, it just feels like somebody smeared oil all over your windshield. You just can't focus on anything outside of the car. And it made it really difficult for me to gauge my turns and for me to do any sort of like distance gauging. I just had a lot of trouble with it. And after about 3 or 4 laps, I felt sick. So I would say that if you're using a triple monitor setup, Assetto Corsa is probably going to look great. But if you want to race in VR, I highly recommend, if you try out Assetto Corsa Competizione and you try out the VR settings that are available online and you still feel like it looks good, then I mean, that's great. But for me personally, VR just didn't look good in Assetto Corsa. And iRacing and Automobilista 2, I was able to just turn them on and put on my helmet and get in and start driving. And I didn't have to do any configuration or setup, which surprised me because in Project Cars 2, I did have to fight with the settings a little bit to get it to look the way that I wanted it to. But Automobilista 2 looks really good in VR. It feels pretty good. So I would say if VR driving is the primary way that you want to race, then you might want to consider iRacing or Automobilista 2. And if you're okay with spending time fighting with the settings, it's possible that the settings for Assetto Corsa will look good for you, but they didn't work for me. For AI racing, again, iRacing is in first place, Automobilista 2 is in second place, and Assetto Corsa Competizione is in third. Now, to my credit, I did try to fight with the AI configuration settings. I tried to set the aggression and the skill to higher and higher settings, but I still found situations where the AI drivers in Assetto Corsa Competizione would just randomly decide to punt me off the track, even if I was clearly ahead of them and I braked with enough space for them to clearly know what I was doing, for the game to be able to detect the distance between me and the car behind me. But I still had situations where the AI drivers in Assetto Corsa Competizione, they kind of drove like they were on a rate, on a train track. Like they just didn't move left to right. Like they just drilled straight through me like I wasn't even there. But with iRacing, the AI implementation was the best. It was top notch. Unfortunately, not all cars are available. So I imagine that they're probably developing little by little and adding more cars to their AI option as time goes on. But the 488 GT3 wasn't available in AI, so I wasn't able to actually do a direct comparison for GT driving in iRacing and AI versus like Automobilista 2 and AI. But Automobilista 2 AIs, to its credit, even though it's a very early release, the AI drove really well. I found it to be very competitive, and they definitely tried to pass me whenever I made a mistake. When it comes to content, I think it's hard to choose because your priorities are going to have a large impact on the amount of content that's available to you. For example, if your wallet's deep enough and you don't mind spending money, then iRacing is definitely in first place. Because if you're willing to spend, iRacing has way more laser scan tracks and a lot more cars available compared to the other simulators. But I think even if you get the 30% discount with iRacing, you're going to find yourself spending what, like $2,000 to get all of the content that's available. And I mean, the one thing is that if you unlock all the content, then any future content, you automatically get a 30% discount, even if it's only one item. But in my opinion, that's quite expensive. For $2,000, I would almost be tempted to just buy a Mazda Miata and race on real courses in real life. And part of the reason why I get into simulation racing is because it's much more affordable than racing real cars in real life. So for me personally, I don't want to spend that much money on iRacing because the balance of power patches could immediately render a car that you previously bought irrelevant. And I think that Automobilista 2's physics and Assetto Corsa Competizione's physics are so good that if you join a league or if you join a club, you can get some pretty good racing even though you don't have the online matchmaking system of iRacing available to you. So when it comes to base content, what's available inside of the simulator at the time that you purchase, I'll say that in my opinion, it's kind of a tie between Automobilista 2 and Assetto Corsa Competizione. So Assetto Corsa Competizione has the best value when it comes to cars. So the GT3 cars that are available in Assetto Corsa Competizione are much better, in my opinion, than the other two simulators, if you like GT3 racing. I mean, they have the Porsche, they have the Aston Martin, they have the McLaren and the Ferrari and all these different GT3 cars. And each of those cars, they all behave very differently compared to the others. So you have a wide variety of driving mechanics for all those different cars. But when it comes to courses, Automobilista 2 has a pretty clear advantage. I mean, this is the 1.0 release, and they already have like over 30 tracks. And some of the tracks even have the 1976 and the other historic versions. The tracks have like the Indy version versus like the full version versus the Grand Prix version. There's just so many courses available. I didn't even know some of those courses existed. So, I mean, like, if you want to try a bunch of different tracks and you don't mind that you only have like one type of car available for each series, I would say Automobilista 2 offers a lot of advantages. Overall, I'm pretty happy that I bought it. And this isn't a biased opinion. Nobody's paying for my games. Nobody's providing my games for free. I wish they would provide me games for free. Are you kidding me? Like, if I could become a pro YouTuber, that'd be awesome. But yeah, I mean, I had to pay for the game myself, and I don't regret it at all. There's going to be a lot of people complaining about the bugs and the issues that exist in the game. Give the developers a chance. You know, it's the 1.0 release, and I think a lot of them are probably working from home due to the current situation that's going on right now. And to their credit, they've been responding a lot to the criticism and feedback that's online. They're probably going to watch this video and they're going to see the bugs and issues that I talked about. And I wouldn't be surprised if the next version in Automobilista 2, a lot of those issues were fixed. So this review might even be irrelevant in 1 month or 2 months after they've released 1.1 or 1.2 or whatever their versions are going to be called. So it's important to be open-minded, I think, especially if you're a casual racer. I would say, I mean, give it a chance. It's what, like $35 right now or $40 on Steam. So you know, what more do you have to lose by trying it out? You know, the best case scenario, you get a bunch of South American tracks that you can't drive in other simulators to try out, and I think that that's pretty cool. Bring on the weird stuff. So thank you for watching the video. If you like this video and you want to see more casual racer perspective videos, subscribe, let me know, comment of what you want to know about. If you're interested in hearing about what it's like to be a sim racer, even though I live and work in Tokyo, let me know. I'll talk about that too. Otherwise, thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe. Have fun.